Welcome to Lead Live, a conversation for ministry leaders by ministry leaders. I'm Josh Franks.
And I'm Clint Berry, and we're the co-founders of the Lead program. Today on Lead Live, we're joined by Erika Lara to talk church multiplication training and internal culture.
Well, hello and welcome to Lead Live. I'm here with my partner in crime, Clint Berry, joining us from up north. Clint, where are you at currently?
I'm at the North Central District Conference, which sounds like I'm in a hockey arena. It's actually their attempt at a basketball gym, and the internet here is like from Siberia. So it may be a bit intermittent on this episode of Lead Live, but it's been a good day so far. Good flight, good masked flight. I'm smelling my bad breath all the way to Minnesota.
Sure.
So it's good. Yeah. How about you? What's up, man?
You got to learn to take a mint when you go long periods of time in a masked required zone. That's the key. You don't want to kill yourself with your bad breath. We're doing good navigating life, and just had one of my kids sitting next to me working on remote learning school stuff. And so we know everybody else is trying to deal with those things daily. Every Monday, it's like a new adventure, I think, trying to figure this stuff out. So, but I'm grateful to be with you today. I'm excited for our guest. We have Erika Lara. I hope I said that right. Erika Lara. She's tuning in from Brooklyn, and she's one of our presenters for church multiplication training that we've been putting together, an online tool for those who want to grow in a vision for church and ministry multiplication that God has given you. So we're excited to have her with us to talk about internal cultures and how do you build, maintain, and change the internal cultures of church and ministry. So we welcome to Lead Live, Erika Lara. How are you doing?
What's up, Erika?
I'm doing great. What's up, guys?
Good. Glad to have you, Erika. I know you tried to convince me to introduce you in a Hispanic accent, but I just wasn't willing to risk it at all. Sorry.
I believed in you, Josh, with all my heart. I did.
And listen, I appreciate that. That means a lot. I'm sorry to let you down, but it won't be the last time. So, Eric, would you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you are, and what you do in life and ministry?
Sure. So my name is Erika Lara, Erika Lara. And I am from Brooklyn. I've been living here with my family. This spring, it'll be 7 years. I am co-planting with my husband in Crown Heights. We are in the very beginning stages of that season. My day job, I'm an area director in the same neighborhood that we're trying to plant in Crown Heights. And so I've been doing Young Life ministry there for about 4 years. Actually, my anniversary just happened last week, so I just made 4 years. And yeah, I have a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, and we're doing life and ministry and all the crazy in between here in the city. So yeah, that's us.
That's awesome. Really cool things that are happening there. And you're talking about living in Nyack. So does that mean you're a Nyack grad, ATS grad, any of those things?
I am. Well, I am a Nyack grad. My husband is a Nyack and an ATS grad.
Okay.
So he's got both of them under his belt. So I don't know if that counts for me, but yes, we're both Nyack grads.
Awesome. Shout out to Nyack and Alliance Theological Seminary. Any current students or alumni that are tuning in can say hi to Erika and her husband. So let's talk about internal culture. When we think about being ministry leaders in local church ministries or other ministries or in the church in general, as you're navigating some of these things with Young Life and church planting, what exactly are we talking about when we are talking about internal culture?
Sure. So I think that, and I feel like I've mentioned this when I was sharing in the training module, that every community is unique, right? We all have the same foundation, the same biblical foundation. We are all about the gospel and all of the things that God has called each of us to. But I think the way that that fleshes itself out looks different in every community. And so the internal culture is just simply like what that specific community feels like their plan and their purpose in that neighborhood or in that city or in that town would be. And so coming along that and kind of linking arms as a team to be able to pursue that together. So, I mean, I think it's something that, again, it's not something that happens like, oh, we're going to be this and it happens overnight. I think it's something that takes a lot of time. And it's something that everyone kind of has to buy into. Everyone kind of has to kind of stack hands on, and everyone kind of moves that culture forward.
Right. Definitely. I totally agree with you. There's, when we think of church planting, we think of an external culture, which is the people that the church exists to serve and to reach. Who are those people? What are their values? What is important to them? What kind of language and schedule do they keep? And then there's the internal culture, which would be the people who are who God is bringing together. What kind of values and schedules and language are they going to use in order to kind of define and allow to direct how they're going to do, different types of ministries. So, so when we think of internal cultures, often we think of values or core values or a set of values.
Yep.
And so what's an example of a value or a value set that would define an internal culture in a church or ministry?
So I think, again, everyone will have these different values that they're going to flesh out. And things like, you're going to be about engaging or outreach in the community, or you're going to be about loving your neighbors, or you're going to be about, a lot of these things will sound and maybe even look similar to each other. But I think the way it fleshes itself out in that community is different. Like what you were saying, like depending on the demographic or depending on the neighborhood itself, I think those things will shift. But yeah, I think we could be about a lot of different things, right? I feel like we could get lost and there's so many good things and good work we all could be doing, right?
Yeah.
But I think it helps to really fine tune what those values are so that the church and that leadership can move the church forward and being really specific. Something that I've been really thinking about recently, and just in the midst of COVID and all that's going on, we're all kind of having this space where we can kind of reevaluate and kind of reassess, like, what are those values? And if we're doing these, like, are we actually doing the values that we said we were about? Like us doing the crazy, all of us are always on the hustle and moving. And I know that it's everywhere, not just New York City, that everybody's moving from thing to thing and it's just busy, busy, busy. And I think with us having to be forced to kind of slow down, some of us have had that opportunity in our churches and our ministries to be able to kind of like really strip it back and be like, what are we about? How are we moving forward? And are we actually doing what we said we would do? So that's just something that I just kind of was thinking and reflecting on as we're talking about this idea of internal culture, even in the midst of COVID and what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think that's great because when it comes to internal culture and those values, you gotta be able, even though often they're very intangible things, their motives, their, the hows of what you're doing, you've got to be able to evaluate, are we actually living out of that? Or are there steps that we need to take in order to not just move me personally? They're not just my values, but that they're shared values, that we're actually living out of them and not just writing them down and saying that this is who we want to be, but we're not actually doing that, is so important. Right. So Erika, when it comes to values, one of the things that I think trips a lot of people up in this area is the difference between, specific and unique core values and just a biblical worldview. because there's some things that the Bible is going to inform when it comes to ministry that all churches should be doing, or all church or all ministries should be doing. But then there's like the unique expressions of that. And how can our leaders begin to tell the difference between what is like a universal kind of command or mandate and what is a unique expression of that?
Yes. I love that word, like that. There's different expressions of a way that's going to be fleshed out. So it's kind of like, if you're looking at it like a funnel, there's obviously this bigger part of that funnel that has, like, we all kind of sit in that with the, like you were saying, with the biblical worldview and the things that our faith is grounded on, right? And the things that we all are living, we want to live our lives out, whether we're involved in ministry or not. Like that's who we are as people of faith. And so those are those things up here, right? And then as we're kind of making it more micro, we're starting to think about like specifically where we are, like in our demographic and where we live and the people that live here and the problems and the issues and the specific things that people are wrestling with. Yes, there's a lot of things that are overflow and the same everywhere, but in every place, there's obviously some things that are more highlighted, you know? And so if your church community would maybe be thinking about those specific things and how they're going to be able to tackle those things, that's more of a specific value. We're going to be about such and such group of people, or like, how can we help to meet these needs? Those are making, obviously that's being a good neighbor, right? That's loving God and loving your neighbor, but it's fleshed out. The way we're going to do that is X. The way we're going to do that is Y. And that what I decide in my community might look different from yours, Josh, but ultimately we are following the Lord's leading in that, right? And we're following his spirit in that. And then we're also trying to be holding both of those things, the practical with the spiritual, and trying to meet those needs in a holistic way that a community can come around a neighborhood or a city or a town and really just do, live out their faith and live out their church values like that. So.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Again, the external and the internal cultures, or the external culture definitely needs to inform the internal culture. I'll give an example of this. Our church is in Columbus, Ohio, and we're loosely connected with many other churches that are in our city. And when this fall school year started, there were many churches that said, hey, Columbus City Schools, those kids are going to need some help. Many of those churches exist and serve in underprivileged and underserved areas of our cities, and in schools that aren't fantastic. But our church is like in a northwest near suburb of the city. And so there was like this unified effort to start these things called learning extension centers. These free kind of during the day, churches will staff and help kids that may not have a great home support life, like walk through some of that remote learning and online learning. And we're like, hey, we want to be a part of this. We want to help serve families. Like that's one of our values is serving families and serving kids. And so we like fully embraced that model. And people in our area just didn't have the same felt need, where they didn't feel as overwhelmed, or kids don't feel as unsupported as maybe some of the more urban areas of our city. And so we felt like it was super clunky and there wasn't a great response, and we were trying to navigate that. And that's even because while we had that, kind of biblical mandate to reach our community, to serve our community, the value of that ministry model didn't necessarily meet the need of our community. And so we were joking about that as we were, trying to navigate some of these things. It would have been better if we would have started like a paid kind of tutoring academic success program than this is a free, if you don't have help at home, we can help you kind of program was just an interesting thing. And that was part of that value set. We embrace the mandate. We embrace the understanding that God's placed us to reach our community.
Right.
But the value didn't meet the need in the community. And I think that's one of the things that many church and ministry leaders need to know, especially because it's so easy to find plug and play programs. And just because the program is good or easily accessible or something that you don't have to prepare, right? We're all struggling with margin and like finding time. So even to find something that's plug and play, if that choice and the values that kind of program is bringing to meet some type of need for your community, if they don't line up, then you lose effectiveness.
Oh yeah.
And so it's so important to try to figure the difference between those things out.
Yeah, 100%.
So when we think about that, Erika, how would you go about determining, hey, this is obviously it's divinely inspired in many ways, but what are some of the ways that you determine the specific values or internal culture that a church or ministry should have?
I mean, I think ultimately in the beginning stages of that, it does kind of go from the inward and then outward. So inward as in like the initial like pastor and the leaders of who are kind of leading the charge. I think some of those things are going to come and be birthed from that kind of group, and then kind of filtered out. I do think something that what you were saying made me think like, it just shows how important that ownership piece is for people to really feel like that buy-in. What you were saying is like, oh yeah, some people were vibing with it. Some people were like, nah, it was like everyone kind of has to be on the same page with what those initial things are. And so I think we could get lost in that, right? And like I said, doing a lot of different things. And so I think it's important for us to really be able to iron out what those are as a smaller like leadership team and a unit, to not only have it on paper, like you said, but also like how it's being, like they're actually doing it. You can actually see it. Where does it show up? How is it showing up? Where is it in our calendar? How is it on the way that we're spending our money? Like if we're all about, let's just say everyone's like, oh, we're all about doing food for the homeless. And that is like one of our big pillars. Then that's great. But it shows up like once a quarter, or there's like barely any, like it doesn't make any sense. You know what I mean? And so it's not something that's actually valued because it's not something that shows up often. And so I think those values, those initial values, they come from that and that inner core team. And I think it builds itself out. And I think it needs to happen outside of that team, in a way that people can articulate it. People can not only articulate it, but also do it. Like that's just, it becomes the heartbeat of that community. It's like, oh, they all kind of are tracking with the same thing. And not just the pastor, but anyone that's maybe a part of that community.
That's great. Could you maybe give us some examples of, as you guys are navigating planting a church or in your ministry with Young Life, what are those internal cultural pieces that you say, these are non-negotiables? This is how we're going to reach our community and do ministry.
Sure. It's been interesting within Young Life in specific. We have like an overall like organizational mission, right, that we all come under, which is introducing adolescents to Christ and helping them grow in their faith. But then like many smaller church plants, we all kind of have our own entities, right? We all come underneath that banner. We all kind of have our own things. And so for me, I've had to kind of create what that's going to be, what's that going to look like in Crown Heights, right? How are we going to flesh that out and what's most important? And so for us, we've kind of narrowed it down to 3 different things: to outreach, engage, and mentor students. And so everything that we do kind of fleshes itself out of those three things, again, under the banner of this bigger, like it would be the equivalent of like a bigger church organization having this like initial thing, and then you're coming underneath that. And so for us, like, obviously, I know I say it over and over again, but we're bathing everything in prayer. That's number one. And then number two, those are the three pillars that we're kind of sticking everything under. And the way that it's looked, especially within now COVID and everything, we continue to innovate. We continue to shift things around, but we do not waver from those things that we initially said. And so the way in which those things are happening are different, and they're changing, and they're still changing. But we don't waver from how, like the what, like what is our why? We don't waver from that. And so for us, we've kind of leaned into those things, and that's helped us, because when there's so much shift and so much change, especially right now, it's like, it just kind of helps us to stay grounded. And so I think figuring out what your community really wants to like kind of lay their ground on and like lay the foundation on will help to bring longevity too. Like, I mean, I would say I'm very a baby in this. It's only been 4 years, but churches that have been longstanding, that have been years and years and years, I think it's because they've had that internal culture, those specific values that they're saying that they're going to stack hands on, even as things continue to shift and change year in, year out. And as culture itself continues to shift and change, I think we have to stay grounded even more so that we're not kind of just going and coming with whatever is happening. Does that make sense?
For sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
I was wondering, Erika, you said there's some things that, the principle is going to stay the same, but then how it gets done. Could you give, like, when it comes to prayer, like pre-COVID, and then COVID happens, but prayer is still a thing that you're going to get after. So like, how did that change? Could you just give our audience a little bit of the tutorial on, we were doing prayer like this, and now we're doing it like this in the COVID season, and kind of give us a before and after of how that shift had to happen with your organization?
Sure. So, I mean, I think with prayer, and other things that we've done, we've had to change in how we're doing that. Obviously, a big obvious way is not together in the same way that we've been doing it in person. So that's been the biggest thing that has shifted. But we have continued to find ways and avenues to be able to continue to do that work, and to do prayer, and to get together. So for us, ministry wise, just to give you an example, so we do a lot of our stuff in the schools, we do a lot of our stuff within the community centers. And so obviously a lot of those things don't exist right now. We still have those partnerships, we still have those relationships, but we haven't been able to do ministry in the same way. And so we have become more innovative. Like you mentioned the whole classroom thing, Josh, where we were looking at doing similar work, because a lot of our kids don't have the support that they need to be able to do remote learning, and parents can't stay home and they don't have that flexibility. And so we were thinking about doing, actually there's an area in Atlanta that's doing YL classrooms. And so we had looked at that as a model that we could follow as well, as a way to continue to do the work that we're doing. But we do a lot of, just like any other church ministry, we're doing a lot of things where we're packing people into a room and we're having, a great time together, and that has not been able to be. So a lot of our things, we've been trying to recreate those things virtually. But again, I don't want to, what I want to say is that we haven't been, I don't want to do things for the sake of doing things. You know what I mean? Going back to the values thing, you know what I mean? And so I think it's how we've had to reevaluate a lot of like, okay, we've been doing this cool thing, but why are we doing that thing? And do we still need to be doing that thing with limitations, and our capacity is like not the same? You kind of have to like really boil down to, have you guys read the book Essentialism?
I haven't, no.
Oh, it's such a good book. You should read it. And leaders who are listening should read it, Essentialism. It's a great book, but it's just about kind of like, again, like narrowing it down to what's most important. What are your priorities? And like really like bringing it down, like stripping it all down to what is the most important. Because I think it's so easy for us to get our hands into everything. And so for me, what has been my survival mode as a leader in this season has been just that. Like, what can we do with sustainability? What does the Lord want us to do? in this season, and how can we be faithful to what he's asked us to, and not necessarily looking at what other people are doing, because I think it's really hard with comparison. Like, oh, they're doing that really cool thing, I want to do that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we should be doing that. And so just really finding that balance of like, okay, I'm gonna like seek after the Lord and remember the things that we said that we were gonna stack hands on, and how would that look like in this season for us. I don't know if I answered that. I was all over the place, but I don't know if I answered your question, Clint.
I think that's a beautiful image to think about. What are the things that we're going to stack hands on, going back to the idea of ownership. And these aren't just values that are run and gun from a leader, but that people are choosing to buy into and give their lives to. If you're just joining us on Lead Live, we are with Erika Lara. We're talking about internal culture, why that is important to lead and develop that with intentionality. Erika is a part of our church multiplication training that we're getting ready to launch here in the coming weeks. Megan, I see your question about church multiplication and what we mean and what we're talking about today. Megan asks, when you say church multiplication, do you mean planting more churches out of the church whose internal culture is being shaped? I think the short answer to that is yes. Of course, when we are talking about leadership, we want to be leading organizations, ministries, and churches that are healthy. And often we don't include multiplication as one of those values internally when we are talking about starting new things. And so multiplication should be one of those internal cultural pieces for any ministry, or else it all relies on the centralization of the effectiveness of a leader. So yes, Megan, definitely. We're talking about what are the values and what are the uniquenesses of a church and each church or ministry when it comes to what God has called them to. If you have any other questions and you're tuning in, feel free to ask. We'd love to answer those when it has to do with internal culture and core values and uniquenesses of churches and ministries here in the world that we find ourselves in. Erika, one of the things I appreciated you saying is that you, when it comes to young life, you have three kind of these priorities. And I remember the first two: outreach, engage, and what was the last one?
Mentor.
Okay, outreach, engage, and mentor. And so I wonder if we could jump into one of those and talk about kind of the unique expression of how you did it pre-COVID, and what are the things that have shifted and changed as you've responded to kind of this new culture that you find yourself serving in. And so I wonder, maybe we could choose the first one, outreach.
Sure.
So pre-COVID, what did outreach look like, and what are some of the values that drove how you are reaching out to students?
So outreach for us looked like I mentioned before, us going into the school. So I was in one of the local high schools twice a week at minimum, and just hanging out in the cafeteria with kids and I had leaders with me as well. And so we would just kind of just be present, hang out, be around. And so that was a way that we outreached, and we met tons of new students weekly doing that. And so it was a way for us to kind of bridge the school to what we were doing outside of the school. And so we have done that. And then, with a lot of our various ministries, with our basketball ministry, and with our just basically anything that we do, we've just been kind of be able to use kids to come from the school into that. And so obviously we haven't been able to do that. And so we are looking for now, we're utilizing a lot of our current students and having them bring new people to us virtually as a way to do outreach in this season. Because for us, we're very much outreach driven. Our organization is very, very outreach driven, but we are also all about growing deeper with our students. And so how do we hold on to both of those things in the midst of COVID, and not just like, let's continue to develop the people that we have, but also we need to be continually having a stream of new folks that are coming in. And I know that that's the same for churches across the board. You're trying to do both at the same time. And so now with COVID, we've been leaning on that as a way, as far as like our students, but also, you know, just trying to be really creative in how we're connecting with students, right? And so one of the ways that we're trying to do that is by creating a pen pal program with some of our new middle school students that we're meeting in this fall. We're starting brand new ministry, which is kind of crazy in the midst of COVID. We've been doing high school based ministry. And so now we're moving into middle school ministry. And so I'm like, I can't do what I normally do. What I would have normally done is gone into the cafeterias, hung out, been a presence, been around. I can't do that in this season. And so how can we figure out a way to interact with students in a way that's safe, in a way that families feel okay with? And so we're doing this Pen Pal initiative as a way to connect students with mentors, as a way to do outreach. It's kind of hitting a lot of those three pillars that we talked about, but in different ways. And so we're looking to do that. We're looking to help with some socio-emotional needs for some of those students as well, because they have a lot of social emotional learning that's specifically put into their day because of the pandemic that we're in. And so we're actually going to be linking arms to help schools with that as well, but it's all virtual.
Yeah.
And so, we've just, there's still need, and there's still like all of those things are still present. It's just the way it looks is completely different. I would very much rather be in a room full of 50 screaming teenagers than be like trying to navigate what virtual looks like, and getting them online this spring was like, but it's been better. We've been doing it more. They're a little bit more acclimated to it. And so we've gotten, you know, better at it, but it was definitely a challenge. And so I'm sure it's the same for everyone else that's been trying to navigate and like transporting their ministries into a virtual manner. So,
right.
Yeah.
So I think that's really cool how you've flexed with some of the things, but maybe we could say like the culture of how you chose to do outreach was very incarnational and relational. And that's why you felt the shift when it came to quarantining and not being able to be with one another. And obviously there's a limited relational ability in a virtual environment. It's better than nothing. But it's not as good as in person. And so you feel some of those things more because you carry that value so much. There's other ministries who may think of student outreach as, hey, we just need to go flyer a campus and invite them to a big event that we're having. And so I hear you saying that's not our value set. That's not the culture that we're more incarnational. We're more relational. We want to be present with kids.
Yep.
There's not necessarily one that's better than the other or one that's wrong and one that's right. But I think that's a good example of how culture and values shape how you do something. Outreach to students, that's something that God lays on your heart, but how you do that is there may be another ministry that says, listen, we're just going to show up and tutor, or we're going to meet needs, or we're going to provide counseling service or something like that. You know, it's very much like a needs-based kind of outreach to students. So even having clarity on those things, and you have so much clarity, you're like, we're incarnational, relational, and we're bringing people with us so that you can stack hands on that value when it comes to, and probably not just outreach to students, but you could probably say those values influence and impact all of those areas, the outreach, the engage, and the mentorship.
Yes. Yeah, I think what you're saying is really important for leaders to remember, is that when you are fostering this kind of culture, whatever it is in your specific community, is that you do want to figure out ways to inject that into your, like, the people that are a part of your community. And so a lot of that is going to be seen and not just heard and not just read on a piece of paper. And so like most of the things that I do, I'm always having somebody with me, always. Even if it's a meeting, even if it's just hanging out or dropping something off or whatever it is, like, because we want to model that, because we want it to go way beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
And so if for me, I'm trying to work myself out of my role. Like I'm trying to take steps back so that I can see others moving into that, especially within our internal culture. I really want our kids to be the ones that are leading this charge, like that I'm just supporting them, setting them up, so and helping them to engage, and they're the ones that are doing the outreach. They're the ones that are doing the outreach, the networking, the engaging, the mentoring, and I'm just kind of providing that support. And so I think it's really what you said. It's just a really good note to make as far as any church body that's trying to build a specific kind of culture, to be able to really be modeling that with people that are not necessarily in leadership, people that are not, that you see potential in, or that you see that could be a really important contributing part of your church community, to really link arms and bring them along. And I feel like there's way more impact in that in some ways than even a sermon that we could share, or, a devotional we can do, or whatever. I think there's something about that experience that, and again, I'm very the way we do things is very relational. And so I get that. Sure. So I know that we're more on that end, but I think in general, it's just a great practice to have in general, as you're trying to build this culture over time.
But it also makes it
Clint.
possible. Yeah, it also makes it possible to pivot. So because you have the values clearly designed and articulated, you can say we're incarnational, relational. So how does outreach need to change? It was in-person craziness, and now it's got to be online crazy, or outside in a big field or something. You know what I mean? Like we're at a park, but we're distanced and masked. Like we can still do these things because the relational value set is still there. It's just that it's got to pivot. And I think that's the great thing about having clearly defined culture, is that then you're just going to say, well, the expression of that culture has got to change, because we can't do that anymore. So we can still hold on to the same value set, but we've got to change it. So how are we going to change it? And then the activity or the expression of that value can shift really simply. And I think that that's what you're expressing also. So for our leaders who are watching, make sure that as you're clearly articulating it, it's a value, like how you discern it. It's a value when you can say, okay, what's the expression going to be like in scenario one? Then come up with a completely new scenario. What's the expression going to be now? And it could be totally different. And that's when you've got a value, because it's not necessarily something you can put on the calendar. Does that make sense?
Yes, I love that. Yeah.
So I think one of the cool things about internal culture and values, as you've been expressing them, Erika, is that, like you said, it's very unifying. Mm-hmm. It's something that you rally people around. This is how we do it. This is the way that we do stuff like outreach. But anything that's unifying is also excluding. And oftentimes when it comes to Christians and churches and ministries, we don't like that word, the idea of excluding. But there is something about the uniqueness of what God's called you to, that if you really believe it's from the Lord, not only are you rallying people to it, but it is gonna, in some ways, help people self-deselect, if that's a word. I don't know how many hyphens you can have in a word for it to be grammatically correct. But so if you had people that came and said, hey, we want to be a part of Young Life, and we want to, going back to our example of outreach, we want to throw this huge concert, and we just want to flyer I don't really want to build relationships with kids, but we want to get them. It's going to be a big party. Some, really polished speaker is going to communicate the gospel, and then that's the win kind of thing.
Sure.
From what you said, that sounds like an easy, hey, that's not really what we do kind of conversation, right?
Yeah, I think it's very true that when you have those things in place, you're able to say no, and it's okay to say no to things, and it's okay to not be all things to all people, and it's okay to be like, you know what, like I feel like for me personally, there's a lane that the Lord has me on. This is my lane. That's not my lane, even though there could be really cool things in these other lanes that I'm like, yo, I could do that. or I could get with that, and then all of a sudden you're like, I know that everyone has that. And it does sometimes feel like exclusive, where you're like, man, I wish let's just get everybody in here. Let's get everyone in here. But at the same time, it's like, I think those boundaries are important. It also helps us to be able to really fine tune the things that we're doing with purpose, with intentionality. I feel like that's been the word for me throughout this whole pandemic, has been intentionality. Like being intentional about the things that we are putting our feet to. Like, what are we putting our hands to? And like, why are we doing these things? And so again, I think some of it has to do with the fact that we have, very, very limited. We're very limited in the season with our limits. And I know for me as a parent, and I know you guys are parents as well on the call, but I think that it's kind of been like the Lord has used that to really like make me to just yield and rely on him even more, for him to, because he's enough. Like he's going to fill in all those gaps. Like, I'm nobody. You know what I mean? He doesn't need me to do anything. And so at the end of the day, it's like, there's all these work and all these great things that we could be involved with or partnering with or doing. And I think everyone needs to just really lean into what it is that the Lord's calling them to. And that's okay. I feel like that's fine. Like, I think all of us, even on just being represented here on this call right now, we all have such different lanes that the Lord has us on, but it's unique and it's for you. It's for Josh. It's for Clint. It's for Erika in a way, and our communities that we're serving in, and that's okay.
Yeah. And even expand that to for your church. And that's kind of the beauty of having multiple expressions of the church in a location, is that you can bless each one of them and the uniquenesses that God has called them into if they're embracing that. Clint, what were you going to say?
Well, I think I loved what Erika was saying there. Not only does it help you say no, it helps you shape conversations with the people who are not only coming into your organization, but also kind of what I'll call like the B2B. So the business to business in this, or the organization to organization, is like, I'm having a call earlier today, and on the call, like, one of the values within the LEAD program internally that we have is students first. And so I'm trying to shape that conversation by saying, all right, so what puts the student first, right? In although we're talking about like what makes them the priority for us, and what that does is now I'm bringing like the full force of the LEAD internal culture to that conversation, and that way, and hopefully, even if that's not a bit of their culture, they can begin to go, oh, that's really valuable to Clint. That's really valuable to the LEAD program, is that the students are lifted up, right, and nurtured and strengthened. And, we build a platform for them upon which to jump off of. And so that was something that I have begun to see recently, like within the last couple of months, as we've clearly articulated our internal culture, and for us to be able to say, you know what, that's an opportunity right now. We need to get on that, because we have a value around opportunities, or, we have a value on, everybody really putting into their leadership role, whether they're doing administration or teaching or whatever. But we use a flying V to tell people at some point you'll be called on to lead, and that's why we've hired you for your role. And so to be able to call those out and celebrate that, but it begins to shape, like with partnerships or other pieces, it's like, hey, you need to lead here because I'm here as a partner, but in order to get us where you need to go, I'm going to follow your lead for a bit. But that's a piece of internal culture that we have, and that we're so clear on the inside that now we can begin to be clear on the outside with our partners in a B2B sort of way, but also those who want to be involved with the LEAD program. We can say, no, that's not how we do it. You just don't get to ride in the back. You better bring your leadership stuff to the forefront here, because that's who we hire. We hire leaders. So there are lots of different bits into this, but I think that it does develop your know, Erika, like what you were saying. And I think it also, in an organization, O to O, all right, B2B sort of way, you can begin to call in other partners and see, do they have the same value set that I have? Otherwise, there's going to be sparks flying all the time within that partnership. So hopefully that's helpful to our leaders as well.
So Erica, one of the things you were saying about this time of things changing is that you've had time to really think through being intentional in what you're doing and how you're doing them, why you're doing them, all of those questions. I'm sure many of the people who are listening and watching find themselves in ministries or churches where they're doing the same thing. They've had time to stop a lot of the busyness and they realize, you know what, the culture that we have here, I don't like it, or there's pieces that I'm uncomfortable with, or there's parts that are unhealthy. And so what's some of your advice, or what steps can you give for ministry leaders to maybe evaluate and begin changing some of those pieces of culture and values that may not resonate with them, and may not be helping them actually accomplish what God has called them to accomplish?
Yeah, I think it's, having the right folks around you, those safe people within the community, to be able to have really honest conversations about what's really working, what's not working, in a way that, you're not worried if someone's going to feel like offended or like there's judgment coming, but just in a way that you can be free to be honest, like with your team and whoever it is that you're working alongside of. I think that's the first step, to be able to be, honest and vulnerable, to be able to like say the truth, and not kind of skirt around it. I think that's something, it's so simple. It's not like I'm saying like, whoa, this amazing thing, but I think it starts there. It starts with some honest evaluation, and some of that starts internally for yourself, and then within your teams, to be able to say, hey, this is not, I'm not, help me understand why we're doing this, or this is what I have an issue with, or whatever it is. And that there's a safe space for people to be able to flesh that stuff out. I think that's the first step moving forward into that. And then being able to make moves, having those values, it's kind of like, it is a gift, because it does provide those boundaries for you and your team to be able to be like, man, like this is a good thing, but I don't think this is something that we need to be spending time and energy and effort on, while it's great. And then maybe you do know someone else's church community that's like, this is totally up their alley, and pass it on. Like that's who we are. We are supposed to be the kingdom. And so like, not all the things are going to line up with me and like my community and like what we're doing, but it may line up with yours, and like helping to support each other in that, I think, is super important. And if there's ever a time for us to link arms, it's now. Like if ever, I mean, it's always supposed to have been, right? But even now, like we need each other more than ever. And so I would say, yeah, just start by having those honest conversations. And even for yourself, like I know for me as a leader, I had to let some things go, because it's like my pride. And I'm like, I wanted to hold on to this thing. And I'm like, man, we're going to make it work. And then it was like, you got to let that go. There were some ministries that I had to let go in this season, that I'm like, you know what, that was for then. And now we need to move in a different direction. We need to pivot, what Clint was saying. And so I've had to do that. And as a leader, like that's hard. That's hard to let some of those things that you've invested in, especially if it's like your baby, or like things that you've spent time and energy and blood, sweat, and tears. And you're like, I don't want to let it go. But when we realize it's not ours to begin with, we can hold those things with open hands, realizing that, you know what, the Lord's got it. And maybe he has something new for your community in this season. Don't miss it. That's one of my biggest fears, is like, man, what if this passes and I missed completely what the Lord wanted to do in me and my team in this season? So, yeah,
there's definitely a difference between like ownership and identity, right? This is what I've always done. It's kind of like the church lady who has a control over the church kitchen or something like that. And it's hard for her to let go, because she's always been in charge of this. And if anybody enters, then they don't get invited in to participate. They get told to get out so they don't mess things up, right? It's easy for us, when we've done things over the course of time, to not be able to have that ability to reflect honestly and critically about effectiveness, and is this really something that God is asking us to do now?
That's good.
Yeah.
I have a question for the both of you guys. I guess I'm wondering, maybe I'm new to a church ministry. Whether I'm volunteering or I'm on staff there, I'm new, and or maybe you're watching this for the first time. The leader's watching this for the first time, and they're like, "Oh, culture, okay, yeah." What questions do you ask? How do you discover the culture? I'm not talking about changing it or or evaluating it really. I'm just talking about like articulating it and discovering it. So if I was new to the church ministry, what questions should I ask in order to discover what the culture of that organization or body is? What questions would you guys start asking?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would start by asking, like, what are the things that they are most passionate about?
Okay.
Like, what are the things that excites them? The things that they have at the forefront of like their ministry. I think that to me would speak volumes as to what the culture is and what the people that like what's important, what's priority for that particular culture or that particular community. I feel like that would be a good, easy question just to start, even just some dialogue. And I think even from that question will come some other insights that you may have regarding what's important. So
All right.
that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay, so then somebody tells me, "Oh man, you should see our fall harvest party. It is so good," right? I mean, it is so good. Like our fall harvest party, and of course, that's going to get wrecked because of COVID and all that sort of stuff. But Josh, if I give you a event, what's the next question that a leader should ask, especially if I'm all about the fall harvest party or whatever? What's the question in response?
I mean, I think the question then is like, what's the point of the fall harvest party? How do you know it's a good party or not a good party kind of thing? Yeah. What are you trying to accomplish by having a fall harvest party?
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah. What are you trying to accomplish, or what? Well, tell me more about that. What do you like about it? What is important about it? What do you like the most about it? But trying to get to the underlying levels, because I do think I've been told multiple times, man, you should see this. This is what we do really well. And it's an activity. Well, according to what I said earlier, the values are not going to be put on the calendar of all. So you need to get onto the underlying issue as a leader as to why is that so important. And it may pop out to say, well, that's the time when we get to engage with lost people, right?
Yeah.
Now, it could be a very superficial value. The building's full, like it used to be. It could be something that's uncovering something that's not positive. And I think that's something to kind of, with good questions, you can get down to kind of the bottom of it. I just loved the harvest party because it fills the building the way it used to be, 30 years ago or something. But what else comes to mind, Laura, as questions to ask or something to consider as you're trying to discover the culture that's existing? Because you get the blessing of creating it, and now you got to live what you create. But some of us have to incorporate ourselves into it, or we basically show up and are like, oh man, there's a culture here. Now what do I got to do with it?
Yeah, I think another thing that comes to mind too is, starting with the end in mind. Like, what is if you're thinking about like the end in mind, like as far as like what ultimately, and it kind of coincide with Josh's question a little bit, as far as like what if you guys could have one thing, that you guys would want to happen within the church community, what would be a win? Like those kinds of questions, as far as like ultimately what are they trying to drive at? What would they like to see happen? I think if you start with the end in mind and work backwards, that also could be helpful in dialogue and questions and trying to kind of discern what the internal culture would be for that church.
That's great.
Awesome.
If you're joining us just now, we're getting ready to finish up our time with Erika Lara. She is a church planter in Brooklyn, New York, and also works with Young Life. If you have any questions for her, you'd like some specific application to your context, Maybe you're trying to figure out what's good and what's not good. Maybe you are trying to start something God's laid on your heart in this season, something new, and you're trying to navigate what's of value and what is the vision and what is just from the Bible. If you have any questions about that, we'd love to help you with that. Feel free to put your questions in the comments section, and we will try to get to you as soon as we can. Erika, as we kind of wrap this up, do you have any other thoughts when it comes to internal culture that you think our leaders should be aware of as they're navigating this, especially when it comes to this season with COVID and kind of the forced change? It's one thing to choose to change. It's another thing to feel like you're forced to change. Any kind of insight in how to navigate that when it comes to internal culture, or what that has revealed in the ministries that you're a part of?
Yeah, I would say, well, I would go back to that word I said originally, which was intentionality. That's the first thing that I would say, is that it's really important for that, especially in this season, to be able to have those values so that you can do things with intention, and that you're not just doing it for the sake of doing it, or that's because how we've always done it. Especially you'll find that more in like churches that have been around for a while, and it's like, oh, we've been doing this X like over years and years, and then someone comes, they're like, well, why? Like, what's it for? Like, what's the purpose? But that's tradition, and I'm not knocking tradition. But just sometimes we need to kind of reevaluate those things. And I feel like this season is affording us that ability to be able to go and like reassess things and look at things. And if you're a newer community that's starting, I would say the other word, especially as my husband and I are, in this process very early on with our church community, is just patience. Having the patience to grow culture and be able to foster that is not something that happens quickly. It's something that takes time, and it takes patience, and you have to do those small things and just staying faithful to those little things and those little things. And then it will eventually, yield fruit. But I think that's the word. It's not fun words. That's not really like exciting words that everyone's like, yeah, that's the word I want to hear from God. But patience and intentionality are the two things that come to mind when I'm thinking about this work. And in regards to my Young Life world, like I know that we're still building that, and we're still rebuilding that. And it's been 4 years, and we're going to continue to do that as we enter into multiplying more ministries that we want to have this injected the same culture in what we've already been about. We want that for our new ministries. And so what does that look like, and how do we foster that? And it doesn't have to necessarily be myself leading those things. But how do we do that, and how do we do that well together? How do we, like we said in the beginning, stacking hands on these specific values that we want to be about as we move forward in this season? So, yeah.
That's good. There's definitely a huge difference between the consistency of intentionality that builds culture and just kind of falling into, well, we've always done it that way, or we've never done it that way. And if you're starting something new, just as a warning and a caution, it doesn't take long for people to fall into that. You do something one year, and it comes around that time next year, and people are like, what, we're not doing it? We've always done it this way. Or like, we only did it once. I don't know what you're talking about. So people do, I think it's part of human nature to look for consistency. And consistency is good if it's the consistency of intentionality that helps you build culture. Because culture isn't something you list on a piece of paper. It's not something you post on your office wall. It's something that you live day in and day out. That's so good. Hey, we're coming to the end of our time together. And that means it's time for final thoughts. And so, Clint, if you're with us, do you want to give a final thought?
Yeah, I would love that if I am with you. I'm not sure if I am or not.
You're with us. We hear you.
Great. Sorry about that then. My final thought is this. You have a culture in your organization whether you realize it or not. And it's, going to be, in, as, Erica's word of the day, if you're intentional about it, then you can shape that culture for your organization, and you can say yes to things and no to things. But if you're going to be passive about it, then that culture will shape you and your organization and your outcomes. So it's really important for us to be on the front edge, determining what are we going to be about and the way in which we're going to be about it. So the vibe of it. And I really have appreciated Laura guiding us into this conversation today about internal values. But you have a culture, and my word to you is you need to shape it.
Great. Erika, how
Love
about
it.
you? What would be your final thought when it comes to this idea of internal culture?
My final thought would be just, I guess, to be intentional. And I would say it's a process. Lean into the process. That's what I would say. I'd say lean into the process and don't allow discouragement to shift you in any way, but find like-minded folks that you want to link arms with in this season and go after it together. Even if it's a faithful few, like, do it. And you'll be surprised of the foundation that you'll be able to lay and how it will grow in the seasons to come.
Yeah, it's so good. My final thought would be this: God has given you a uniqueness to lead out of, and that begins to shape the culture of the ministry, organization, or church that God's given you influence over and leadership of. And don't be apologetic for that uniqueness. One of the things that Erika said that I loved is that God has given us each a lane, and we need everybody to occupy their lane, right? If we were all the same, we would only reach a small fraction of the people that desperately need to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. And so fully embrace your uniqueness and live that out and lead out of that to create that intentional culture that God has called you to create and maintain for your ministry and for the effectiveness of your ministry. Hey, Erika, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate you giving up your afternoon to spend time with us. And leaders, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Lead on.